How important is Sovereign Hill's location, like being an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes from Melbourne? Is that a terribly important thing for the international market?
I think we're lucky. We're in the magic, what we say, the 2-hour zone from Melbourne. I think anything outside that zone is challenging for tour operators, apart from those iconic drivers like Great Ocean Road.
Yeah.
And Phillip Island is on that very cusp of that 2 hours.
Is it also important, our location, for the domestic market? Considering that most of Victoria's population is in Melbourne, how important is it that we be close to Melbourne?
I think again it's that magic short distance from Melbourne. They can do it as a day trip.
Yep.
But we're also lucky that Ballarat is a great overnight destination.
The domestic market is generally families, is it?
For us at Sovereign Hill, very much family focused. Our main markets are coming out of Melbourne. About 2.5 million families living in Melbourne, so there's a great audience there for us. The challenge for us is, in a marketing sense, that most people you ask, and you say, I work at Sovereign Hill, they say, well, I went there when I was a child, and it's been challenging to get them back to visit the museum. So researchers have shown that there's almost 90% unprompted awareness of Sovereign Hill, which is fantastic, high awareness.
Well, what do you mean unprompted awareness?
So if you just ask a general question, so you're not prompting, have you been to Sovereign Hill? So you say, what are some of the top attractions in Melbourne, and Sovereign Hill always comes up in usually the top 5. So that's what we say, unprompted. Mm-hmm. If you then say trigger the brand name Sovereign Hill in your question, you're almost up at 98% awareness. But the challenge is, they just haven't been for such a long time. We say it's generational cycles, so they came when they're children. They come possibly as a teenager, as the day's out. They come when they've got their own children, and they come when they're grandparents. So we say there's about an 8 to 9 year cycle of repeat visitation. So the challenge for me is to shorten those cycles.
Yeah.
And how we've done that is running early days an event strategy to themed event over the school holiday periods. This is one of the key periods of travel over those times for our market. I think there's been some big impacts in my time, both when I was at Phillip Island and Sovereign Hill, things like bird flu, September 11, those sort of impacts. But the GFC was one of the big ones. I think economically it affected both international and domestic tourism. Us as a business certainly were impacted greatly. We had probably one of our worst years on record during those times, because international markets dropped out of all areas, Asia and the Western markets, but also there was a softening domestically. So even our domestic visitation was down. The big earthquakes in China, the western part of China, there was some impact out of the second tier cities, which didn't really affect Australia a great deal because the market size was reasonably small. But SARS is a big one for us because it can affect most of the Asian markets. So when that was around, there was big impact out of the Hong Kong, Chinese. Unfortunately, tourism is impacted on via the economy. Natural disasters, terrorism now is at the forefront of everyone's mind.
Yeah.
You could see the impacts of the terrorist attacks in Paris, that there's been a big decline in the actual numbers of visitors to Paris, and that's one of the if we don't have visitors and people consuming our programs, like the school program, we don't get revenue. No revenue, we can't build the museum to what it is today. So all our income is coming from three areas. The gate, so when people arrive, they pay their fees to get into the museum, and then the second one would be souvenirs and what they spend inside, and then the third one would be food and beverage. So back 20 years ago, the people driving or operating Sovereign Hill at the time, the management, were very clever on building those economic drivers for the future of Sovereign Hill, being the overnight accommodation and the sound and light show, which did two things. It told a great story for that period, but it also gave us great revenue overnight, which is people stayed overnight, they spent more money.
Without those new things, because we're talking probably 20 years ago that Blood on the Southern Cross came in and the accommodation was increased. Without those two innovations at that time, what do you think Sovereign Hill would be like now?
I think it'd be a very different beast. I think we'd have lesser staff. I think the footprint would be a lot smaller because we wouldn't have had the dollars to reinvest into the museum and make it what it is today. So it'll be a very different model. To look at, do we broaden out the 10-year period or the 9-year period we represent to the next phase, the next 10 years of the Australian history, and what does that bring for us? If we did that, that means more exhibits we'd have to build to represent those periods. I think in shorter terms, fundamentals, things like improving our entrance facility. I've got a projected growth of 5+%, so that brings some pain points in terms of facilities here, of how we're going to manage that growth. We can only get so many people underground to our underground exhibits. So with China growing at 15% a year on average, we'll reach a point where we can't take any more Chinese underground with the exhibits we've got, exhibitions. So we need to look at how we're going to manage the proposed growth. Our event called Christmas in July in winter has been a new activity for us, a new event, which is driving big numbers. That brings 60,000 plus, and the forecast this year is 80,000. So we've got to ask ourselves how we're going to manage with all those people. Outdoor museums, or museums in general across the world, have faced this challenge of, back 5+ years ago, visitation to museums was in decline across the globe. So it was a challenge where we sit. So museums have to almost reinvent themselves and new energy. And you've seen some pretty big shifts around the globe on how museums tell their story into today's marketplace, because consumers are a very sophisticated beast these days.
Yeah.